Hello, and welcome to the Spectator P.M. podcast. I'm Luther, here with Aubrey. Aubrey, how are we doing today?
Doing pretty well.
So, I understand that you're coming up on a purple belt in Taekwondo, and I have no idea what that means. It sounds like it's sponsored by McDonald's because that's the only group I can think of with purple imagery, but I assume that isn't the case. Could you tell us what a purple belt is?
Yeah, so in Taekwondo there are different levels of belt testing, and I guess it depends on which like strain of Taekwondo you're in, because what nobody tells you about martial arts is that it is incredibly dependent on who runs the school, what branch they're in. So it's more confusing. So like my younger brothers are in a different Taekwondo studio and they don't have a purple belt. It doesn't exist. They have like I think it's like a high blue, which is the same thing. It's just they're just using the same belt or a different belt, which is weird. Um, so essentially, I'm going to try and double test in not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday after, um, which is a little ambitious, but
That's a very homeschooler move. It's just, good enough. We're gonna go do that and succeed. And that's
hopefully,
awesome.
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
I did my tip testing, so I've been approved to test for both belts, which is actually scarier because it's just like you and the instructor, and they're watching just you. Whereas in the test, it's like you and like 40 other people. So
Oh,
if you make a mistake, if it's minor, they don't catch it, you're fine.
hmm. Okay. Um, well, as for what I've been watching, I don't do anything physical. I sat outside in the sun yesterday like a plant.
You
It
need the
was
vitamin D.
wonderful. I printed out my editing and just sat out on the bench in front of the house. Um, Soaked that up for a bit, but I've been tracking the Tesla Cybertruck. And so a vehicle that was announced over 5 years ago, I think, is finally going into production. And so the media's had access to the truck, and some of the promotional stuff is shooting at the truck with 45 caliber rounds, this sort of thing, handguns, and the stainless steel body is strong enough to withstand, small caliber bullets, slower bullets, probably nothing rifle based, but it's an amazing thing. Like it, not only is it a monster, of course, being a large EV truck, I think it weighs close to 4 tons, but because it has these electric motors with instant torque, it can outpace a Porsche 911, like one of the premier sports cars, while towing a Porsche 911. It's just that quick.
That sounds
Uh,
like an Elon Musk move.
yes, it's
Like, what if?
very much from the mind of the guy who launched a car into space. Uh, but what I love about the Cybertruck, whatever it becomes, is that it's what EVs should be, which is nothing that's going to save the world, but instead something that's just really cool technology to mess around with and to use as a toy, as a weekend machine, maybe someday as a work truck, but to sell people on the idea that electrification can work in some ways. And that's all it has to be. Uh, so
Seems like
just
a
taking
plan.
it to the max and goofing around with it, I love to see it.
I mean, who's gonna buy, like, what market is he envisioning? Because, like, your average semi driver does not need something that can withstand rounds of bullets.
You never know. If you've got that South Chicago delivery or if you're moving stuff through Home
That's
Depot
true.
there, I think it's really to take the place of the vehicle you want to be seen around town in. Yeah, you can throw some stuff in the back, but it's really going to inhabit like that third parking bay in your garage where instead of a sports car, instead of the Porsche, instead of, well, probably not the Ferrari sort of class, but the expensive toy category, that's where it's going to sit, and it is going to sit quite often. And then you'll use your regular vehicles, your Lexus, your what have you, day to day. Um, but that this is meant for fun. It's designed for fun. Everything in the design language is meant that way. It's ridiculous. It's it looks like the most basic rendering of a PlayStation 1 era game, and it's just cool. And I like cool stuff in the world. Uh, we need more of it, especially with cars becoming more and more homogenous. Shake it up a little bit. And most of that's due to auto regulation from the feds, which that's a whole other grumble party that I won't subject you to. Uh, but speaking of electrification, coal, Aubrey. We've got some bureaucrats hot on the trail of coal and getting rid of it. What's the deal there?
Yeah, so in some ways, this isn't really a news story. That was kind of what shocked me, that there are like headlines all over the place. Like John Kerry is promising the COP28 global elites that, we're going to get rid of coal. Like, well, that was already on the agenda. But so in some ways, it's not a news story. And in other ways, it kind of is. So at COP28, which is this, like one of the biggest global annual meetings of all of these climate people, they're like heads of state, diplomats, journalists, whatever, are all there. And the US Special Presidential Climate Envoy, I think that's his title, John Kerry, a lot of descriptors before his name now, pretty much kind of went on the rampage against coal because it can't really attack oil because the COP28 is happening in Dubai, in United Arab Emirates, and they were kind of like, yeah, can we like tone down the rhetoric on oil? So we're all going against coal. And he announced that the US is partnering with this Power Through Coal Alliance or something like that. I'm blanking on the name right now. But essentially, we're promising to get rid of coal faster. There's no deadlines. There's no like, here's how we're going to do it. It's just, we're going to do it, which tells me that it's like a bunch of empty posturing. But the Biden administration's been trying to do this for a while. They want to get rid of coal plants by 2035, which is a little over a decade. And at the moment, 19.7% of like the US electrical grid is powered by coal. So within like a decade, we have to transfer that. And for context, right now, like renewables, so wind and solar, only make up, I think, 21.7 or 21.3% of the electrical grid. So, which is way more than they used to, but still, like, that's a major push.
Doesn't that include hydroelectric too?
Not according to the
No?
charts.
Okay.
Yeah. That would make more sense if it did. But yeah, on the like little chart thing that the EPI puts out, it's solar and wind. And then they've got a bunch of like smaller things that are like 0.8%. Like that doesn't count. So yeah, but I think the biggest issue, and this is what I was kind of reporting on, was like shutting down coal plants, especially shutting them down quickly, really impacts the communities the coal plants are in. Frequently, they're in poorer, more rural areas away from bigger cities. They're employing people who don't have a college education, aren't super wealthy, or even like middle class, barely. And so suddenly, like cutting out these really large employers it can easily become problematic for these small rural local communities. And in places where it has happened, there was one story I was reading about a place out in Colorado where they shut down the coal plant several years, I think 3 years earlier than they had planned on doing it. And it was a shock for the community. Fortunately, they're in Colorado, so they just became a tourist town. Um,
Hmm.
that's not the same that's not the case if you're like in the middle of West Virginia though, or Pennsylvania, which has the most coal plants in the country. It's like 16 or something crazy.
Right, and these are simply being shut down, correct? It isn't that they're being replaced by some new industry.
Right. Or that we
That
have a plan for taking the employees and, moving them into a new industry. We just have like we're going to shut down the coal plant and eventually we're going to replace it with renewables.
well, we have 3,000 jobs programs. We'll, we'll offer them nothing of use. Uh, and I think it's especially difficult when you do say that these are not college educated people, that the ability to immediately transfer into similar work elsewhere, leaving aside all of the community institutions and things that, create these social fabrics of interdependency and cooperation. These are not easily transferred. And moreover, well, the free trader of me in me says, well, that's the market. Uh, One should not dismiss one's people having roots and loyalties to an area, especially when coal is still a viable energy source. That's the thing that kills me, is that it's being retired really before its time and before its replacements are ready.
Right.
And so even those who are against coal for its environmental effects, whatever those might be, uh, should be able to acknowledge that, we're getting out over our skis because Democrats just love to do these sorts of signaling moves where, oh, look, we're, saving the planet by effectively shuttering your town around you. Um, sucks to suck. So says the White House. That's not a direct quote. It's just kind of reading between the lines there. But yeah, it does kill me why they all fly out to these remote locations. Um, these heads of state and their appointees, their proxies, and say, "Oh yes, we are excellent people, and we're not actually going to do anything of substance, but we're all going to shake hands and take lots of pictures, and somehow manage to make your life worse wherever you are back home." Like, oh, thanks. Glad we could underwrite that expense. Um, yeah, but speaking of coal, dinks. What in the dadgum is a dink? Because I think I'd call carry a dink, just assuming that it's some sort of pejorative. What actually is a dink? I understand you and Mary wrote about this.
Yeah. So essentially there's this trend on social media where these young couples, so dual income, no kids is what DINKS stands for, the acronym. Um, and they're pretty much just, showing everybody what their life looks like and making it look super glamorous. Like you can go out and eat every night if you don't have kids, which is technically true, maybe not desirable. Or like you can go to Florida on vacation at the, drop of a hat. I'm like, I mean, also true. Although you do have dual income, so you have to figure that one out. But it's one of those things where like it's young, mostly millennial couples for now, because I mean those are the young couples at the moment, um, who have intentionally chosen not to have kids, or not to try, not to like at all do the whole kid thing whatsoever, and instead just spend all of their money intentionally with the goal of not having to pass it down. So
Yeah, and are these being millennials, I guess I'd assume that they probably haven't paid off their student loan debt yet.
one would suppose that, yeah.
And how much of this sort of industry or movement is just leaving aside their financial obligations to go to what is that fun land in Pinocchio?
Oh
Fun
gosh,
Island, something like that. Pleasure Island.
that sounds right. It's been years since I've read Pinocchio. That's actually one of those like creepy kids books. This is way off on a tangent. It's a creepy kid book, kind of like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which legitimately scared me as a small child.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
anyway,
deferred responsibility seems to be a really solid through line here with the dinkage. Is that fair?
yeah, yeah. It's a weird movement. Apparently the term is older though. It's from the 1980s, which actually makes a whole lot of sense when you think about it. It's like tail end of the sexual revolution and
I knew we were gonna get the the, the fish shaking at the sexual revolution. I was gonna say it if you weren't.
I mean, you can blame almost everything on the sexual revolution at some point.
Just about. So it's 40 years in the making, but it's one of these things that's been grabbed by TikTok and
Yeah.
pretended that they invented the term, essentially.
As I mean, it seems like they're a generation who the kind of people who don't think that there was anything that came before them and are not convinced that there will be anything after them, which kind of leaves them in a very interesting spot. I guess that's how you would live if you didn't think the world was going to continue.
Ahistoric nihilism. Woof. That's,
I don't think they're that. I don't think they think that technically of it, though.
yeah.
Just
Hmm.
perhaps their problem.
So, is there another point in history besides our modern moment where this sort of dink existence was possible? I think it must be a combination of one, being able to control in almost every way one's reproduction, but also the ability to travel and have, expendable income, disposable income. Exposable income is what you make when you're a stripper, but disposable income is what you spend when you have extra money lying around. Uh, so, do you think there was a time or place where we could see some sort of parallel?
I think there were probably individuals, maybe, who to some extent practiced it, but I think that the advent of social media making this a popular thing, and then the like, yeah, the fact that we can essentially, to some extent, at least feel like we have control over reproduction, really changes things. Like that has, I mean, that's as recent as the 1930s or 1920s, whenever contraceptive pills came out. Yeah, so I guess it's the first time that we've seen something this drastic of this flavor. I think that there have probably been like earlier examples of similar, similar approaches to life. They were probably not couples though.
Yeah, I'm
Probably
thinking
single
of like the
individuals.
grand tour for young aristocrats in
Yeah,
England where, you go overseas, but that's not really for young marrieds as much as it is. Well, I suppose the honeymoon, but after that, maybe not.
but I don't think they ever intended to never have children.
Right, right.
Which whereas the dinks are like, yeah, no, we have no plans to have kids ever. Like it's just not happening. And that's different. But it's also a denial though of like, and I don't know, like a deep human desire to have kids.
Yeah, so what is the opposite? Would it be, I've heard the term silks before, single income, lots of kids, which
I
is
mean,
probably the homeschool and Catholic alternative
this
to
is
the
true.
dinks.
Yeah.
So
I don't know.
do you think that will become more mainstream where you'll see fewer and fewer? 2 to 3 child families and more with a whole heap of kids, and then a bunch of couples who are against the idea.
It feels like it has been polarizing gradually over time, where you have people who choose not to have kids or have one or two, and then you have like my parents who decided to have 10, which clearly gives me a bias in this situation. um, so it feels like it's polarizing. I honestly don't think the Dinks is gonna take off as like a huge cultural phenomenon that's gonna last for decades. Only because like it denies something intrinsically human and it denies part of the natural law. And I don't think that it can be maintained for an incredibly long period of time. Like, I think even by the time these people, these couples are 40 or 50, they're going to regret their decision. And yeah,
Yeah, my concern is that dinks will influence how a public responds to children in public, where so many
right.
spaces are becoming adultized or deferential to the interests and preferences of adults and give almost no thought to incorporating children into a space. I mean,
I mean,
the
that's already a problem, though.
oh, I think it'll probably get worse as the birth rate declines, and that these couples who have it seems like something where they've probably also cut off their parents. Like there's probably something there where a hatred of one's parents means you don't want to be a parent yourself. These people won't understand kids, can't understand kids, aren't exposed to them or around them, or take delight in them being in the public sphere, and will be hostile out of jealousy and also out of, you know, um, the rarity of proximity to kids. I don't like the sound of that, but hopefully that's just conjecture. I've just invented this dystopian future. Uh,
You may not have invented it.
yeah. Oh, well, may it not come to pass. Um, to
Well, I think
our millions and millions of listeners, go out, have babies, have have fun. That's another thing. Like you're just kind of denying biology at some point, where like,
yeah.
a man and a woman in a married relationship, there's probably going to be a few points where even if you're trying to prevent pregnancy, it's probably still going to happen, and you should have kids. Do that. It's pretty cool. Um, so then this week, looking at Israel a little bit and domestically, the response to it, we saw some Ivy League presidents go before Congress and make a mule's rear end of themselves, I think is a fair description. Uh, could you tell us a little bit about that, Aubrey?
I mean, essentially, that over the last 2 months now, that since the Israel war started, a lot of college students, especially more liberally minded, have been rioting on college campuses, and there has been almost no response from the administration at all. So Congress calls them in, the administration that is, and yeah, and it turns out they could care less about what's going on college campuses. And so it's caused a huge uproar, especially in the media, especially among conservatives who are like, hang on a second, this is like blatant anti-Semitism of the kind we haven't seen since like the 1940s in America. Um, and that's kind of scary considering what happened right after that. So 1930s, 40s. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's utterly baffling watching these executives of, the richest universities in our country, most prestigious universities, go up there and suddenly start saying that we need to take speech in context, where
Right.
terms like fat phobia or standing up for biological reality is hate speech, but suddenly calling for the death of Jews in Israel, it's like, well, you need to understand the context of what's happening here and the oppression matrices, et cetera, et cetera. Like, no, you don't get to do that. You're either pro free speech and people can say all sorts of heinous things and all sorts of correct things all at once, or you can say there are forms of speech that are simply unacceptable on our campus, and then you can have a real discussion about that. But to suddenly shut the gates on the most objectionable speech heard on campus in decades, uh, it sounds like the University of Pennsylvania's president may be fired still this week at some point for her failure to have a decent response for Congress talking about context.
Justifiably so.
And I believe the school's losing out on $100 million that were to be donated to the school by wealthy benefactors. And like, yeah, good riddance. It's not going to make them poor, but it's not going to make them any richer. And that, more than anything, knowing some university presidents, that is the purpose of a university president, is to be a fundraiser. It's not really to run the school, it's to make the school heaps and heaps of money. So if these schools are failing to do so because their leaders are incapable of human decency, that's progress. It's demoralizing that it's taken this long, but it seems like we might be turning a corner as far as American higher education and what is permissible for these schools. That about do it on that one? All right.
I hope so.
And you wanted to talk a little bit about the further ridiculous lies of Joseph Robinette Biden. And we learned the good man's middle name today, and we couldn't quite believe it. But Robinette, what can you tell us about him and his ridiculous lies?
Yeah, so this is a piece from Scott McKay, who decided to chronicle things coming out of the White House instead of writing about the things he wanted to write about, which is, I think, how he started the piece. Yeah, it was just a funny list of the things Biden has said and everything that's gone wrong so far, which is always fun to read. But really, and Scott makes this point, it's really about reminding ourselves that these are things that Biden has said before we forget about them. So I think the particular one that kind of spurned on the article was something he had told a reporter about Hunter Biden recently, and his son, and how he didn't know anything about his business deals, essentially just reiterating that again. And yeah, it's always worth remembering, before he goes back on his word, this is what he said. Now there's this mark in time where we have it recorded, so now we can go back and talk about it.
Yeah, and that this has been his MO his entire career, that this isn't age catching up with the man. He's been a dirty dog liar his entire lying dog face pony soldier, perhaps one of the greatest expressions he ever came up with, which in fact is another fiction of his. There is no such thing as a lying dog faced pony soldier in any of John Wayne's movies. But according to Joe Biden, there is.
Yeah.
So I don't know. If you subscribe to Joe's world, it exists. Many things exist that don't for the rest of us. But But it is amazing to see him invent new controversies for himself, as well as new historical moments where he was walking arm in arm with Mandela or Martin Luther King Jr. at various points. One of those Forrest Gump figures in modern political life. Um, Before we get out of here, is there a piece of media that you'd like to recommend to the listeners?
Well, Scott McKay's piece that we just talked about is great. Um, yeah, actually I do have something to recommend. I recently went to half price bookstores, as one does, because why not? It was a girls' day out, actually, the best place to go when it's just a bunch of girls. And I found N.D. Wilson's the first two books of his first series, which is um, I think the first one is Dandelion Fire, I think. Or no, that's the second one. I have them over there. 100 Cupboards. There it is. They're over there on my bookshelf. Um, they're just a fantastic set of children's literature. My brother and I read them. We were both a little bit older, but it was one of those books where we could really connect and talk about it. He is a Calvinist who was very inspired by G.K. Chesterton, which I've always thought is an odd mix because G.K. Chesterton is so intensely Catholic. But it honestly, like, the underlying philosophy to his children's books is really beautiful. And also, he's just a fantastic writer. Like, the beginning of every story is this well-crafted, like, first page where it really draws you in and also gives you like something metaphysical to think about for the rest of the book, which I really appreciate, especially in children's books. So,
Yeah, you mentioned Calvinism and Catholicism, and I would say that Calvinism is probably the most Catholic of the Protestant sects, in that a Calvinist and a Catholic both like big books, they like beards, they like smoking pipes and cigars, and maybe a little bit of whiskey. So I think in that leather-bound books that smell of rich mahogany, I think there's a brotherhood there,
the vibe is the same, yes, to
despite
some extent.
theological differences. Um, yeah, some are Thomists, and then others are, well, Calvinists. Uh, Big on the tulips, you know. For me, I recently watched a Japanese animated film called Steam Boy, which is a sort of steampunk Victorian England where instead of everything run by coal or by oil, it's expressly steam, which has some physics limitations, but it's really this fascinating view of the West from a Japanese centric or from a Japanese viewpoint. And these Western powers are vying for this new steam weaponry that's being revealed at this London exhibition, and it's all absurd. It's all huge. The animation's incredible, but there are many parallels to atomic energy. And it's interesting seeing the post World War II view. Like, there's this new Godzilla movie out, and again, that's coming from post World War II application of the atomic bomb and what that did to the Japanese psyche, um, where the United States, especially, is seen as these warmongers. And, you know, if someone dropped a nuke on me, I'd be inclined to think the same, but it's also this Japanese revisionism where they don't really mention what was happening in Manchuria, like 1933 through 1945. Like, there's a reason the United States was flying bombers over the Japanese homeland. And it's a phenomenal piece of art The writing is fine. But if you're looking for something kind of outside the mainstream, Steam Boy, I think it's available on Amazon Prime. Definitely worth a watch. And crank the bass all the way up. The explosions are amazing. So, with that, we thank you for listening to this episode of the Spectator PM podcast.